Deathtrap Dungeon. This turned into a lot more than I was expecting. I had this game as a kid, and even though I could never beat the first level, I always remembered thinking it was so cool because of how brutal it was. The audio setting screen alone is insane. And then once you actually start playing the game, monsters are getting fully dismembered, traps are killing you out of nowhere, and the whole thing just feels like it's trying to mess with you from the first few minutes. The problem was, I could never figure out where I was supposed to go, and combat never really clicked for me either. I wanted to like the game, but every time I played it, I just ended up confused or dead. So for years, I assumed the problem was me. I figured maybe it was just too hard because I was a kid. Coming back to it now, I wanted to see if that was actually true. And I was wrong, very wrong. Because this turned into one of the most brutal, punishing, unforgiving games I have ever played. I'm pretty sure I died more playing this than every other game I've covered on the channel combined. But even with all that frustration, there was still something about it that kept me wanting more. It feels almost like a Tomb Raider-style adventure game smashed together with a dark fantasy RPG, and somebody threw in mechs, laser guns, rocket launchers, dinosaurs, and a dungeon where every wall, floor, ceiling, chest, hallway, and switch might be waiting to kill you instantly. It's really rough, and it's extremely clunky, and it's 100% unfair at times. But all of that, especially once you understand where the game comes from, it's what makes it so interesting to me. The unfairness feels like the point of the experience. So why is this game so difficult? Where did the idea start? What was Deathtrap Dungeon?
Back in Fang, townsfolk wait patiently in the taverns, hoping that maybe, just maybe, one day a champion will rise who can conquer the perilous depths of Deathtrap Dungeon.
So let's go back to where the idea started, because before this was a PlayStation and PC game in '98, Deathtrap Dungeon was one of Ian Livingstone's fighting fantasy game books. You know, those choose-your-own-adventure style books that were almost like a solo Dungeons & Dragons campaign. You would read a section, get faced with a choice, and then turn to whatever section number your decision sent you to. Along the way, you'd fight monsters, collect items, roll dice, and hopefully avoid getting yourself killed. These were super fun books. I probably had over 100 of these solo adventure books as a kid. They were a really cool way to get a taste of Dungeons & Dragons when you don't really have a lot of people to play with. The original book was first published in 1984, and it became one of the biggest entries in the entire fighting fantasy series. It sold hundreds of thousands of copies in its first year. And over time, it became one of the books people think of the most when they think about that whole style of adventure. The whole setup for it was extremely straightforward. There's a city called Fang, and every year, Baron Sukumvit opens up this massive, deadly labyrinth called Deathtrap Dungeon. Warriors and adventurers enter the dungeon trying to survive the trials of champions, and whoever makes it through earns fame, riches, and glory. And that's the whole appeal right there. You enter a place designed to kill you to come out the other end rich and famous.
To wager their souls. As a prize, survivors would be rewarded in riches beyond their wildest dreams.
That idea works perfectly for a game book. You read your passage, make your decision, and there could be a bunch of different traps to just instantly kill you. So when Deathtrap Dungeon became a game, the basic idea was already there. The player was entering a trial built around monsters, traps, locked paths, and being brutally punished for mistakes. And I think this context really helps explain why the '98 game feels the way it does, because the game was developed by Asylum Studios and published by Eidos Interactive. Ian was also directly connected to this project, helping shape the game's overall concept and direction, and the team included people with some deep connections to tabletop gaming, fantasy writing, and gamebook design. Richard Hallowell, for example, he had helped create games like Warhammer and Space Hulk. Then there was Jamie Thompson, who was known for his work on some of the fighting fantasy books and the Way of the Tiger series. The team brought together people with a long history in fantasy worlds, tabletop systems, and interactive storytelling. And it's extremely interesting to me, because this adaptation was coming from people who understood that kind of older fantasy tabletop design language. And I think that gives us a pretty good window into what they were trying to do. They were taking this famous, extremely difficult choose-your-own-adventure book and trying to turn it into a physical 3D action-adventure game. And because this was the late 90s, that meant something very specific. This was the era where 3D action-adventure games were becoming a really big deal. Tomb Raider had changed what that kind of game could look like. People were getting used to third-person characters running through big polygonal spaces, climbing ledges, making jumps, finding keys, just fighting creatures, and learning how to move through these dangerous environments. When Deathtrap Dungeon finally came out, people immediately compared it to Tomb Raider. It had the third-person camera, the tank controls, the big dungeony areas, switches, keys, fighting, and platforming. It also had the same publisher, so people were always going to put those two games next to each other. But the timing is worth bringing up here. From what I found, Deathtrap Dungeon was already in development while the first Tomb Raider was still being made. So the comparison makes sense from the outside, especially once both games were out in the world. But this game was already part of Eidos' push into 3D action adventure, and you can really feel that. The game really has that late 90s ambition where developers are still figuring out how to take older kinds of games and make them work in 3D. A choose-your-own-adventure dungeon originally existed in your imagination, just built from text, illustrations, rolling dice, and the choices you made along the way. The 98 game tries to make all that physical. Instead of imagining the dungeon, you walk through it. Instead of reading about traps and monsters, you have to deal with them in real time. The maze becomes a real space, and survival depends on your movement, timing, memory, and just overall awareness. I just think that's so cool, because the game is rough, there's no getting around that, but when you look at where the idea came from, that brutality starts to feel connected to the source. The original Deathtrap Dungeon was already built around a place that wanted to kill the person going through it. The 98 game takes that idea and makes the player deal with it in 3D. That also explains why the game feels so strange compared to something a bit more polished from that same era. It has the shape of a third-person action adventure, but underneath that, it still feels like an old fantasy trial. Every step feels like it could be your last. The dungeon is constantly daring you to make a mistake. There's overpowered monsters, hidden traps, random setbacks in your path, and then punishment the moment your attention slips. And that's where we need to start looking at the game itself. Let's step into the dungeon. The first thing that really surprised me was the size of it. Looking at the game from the outside, I thought I was dealing with around 9 levels. Even the in-game menu makes it look that way. So in my head, I was thinking this might be rough, but it shouldn't take any longer than it usually does for one of these videos. Then I started getting deeper into it, and that number became very misleading. Those 9 levels are really the main areas of the dungeon, and each one is broken up into multiple sub-levels. So there's a lot more to work through than you realize going into it. I was expecting a rough dungeon game. I was not expecting over 30 levels of it. And that changed how I looked at the whole thing pretty quickly. Each major area has its own identity, but that's something the game reveals slowly over time. At the start, the dungeon feels fairly normal. You're moving through the kind of dark stone corridors or underground areas you'd expect from a game called Deathtrap Dungeon. It feels like one large dungeon with a consistent look. Then, once you get a bit further in, you start noticing the themes and how they change a lot more. You reach places like the circus, the hive, and some of the other big areas, and each one has its own feel. You get somewhere new and suddenly everything looks different. The enemies are different. The overall vibe is different. The circus is probably the first really good example of this. It's covered in paintings of clowns filled with demonic clown enemies and evil laughter, and it feels completely different from the earlier areas where you're mostly dealing with goblins. Then you have places like the Belfry, which feels more like a traditional castle full of knights and towers. Or the hive really feels like you're running through some giant insect world. And then there's the trench that's essentially a straight-up war zone. There's rat soldiers carrying guns and firing rockets at you. Even if some of the areas stick around a little too long, I never really felt like I was just running through the exact same place over and over again. So overall, I think the game does an okay job making its major areas feel different. Some of them land better than others, and some definitely run longer than they probably should. But there's a real attempt here to make the dungeon feel like more than one endless stone hallway. Most of the actual progression is built around wandering through whatever section you're in and slowly figuring out how it connects. You get a short chunk of text at the start of an area, and that gives you the basic idea of the level. Then the game drops you in and lets the dungeon do the rest. From there, you're basically just wandering around, checking doors, looking for keys, pulling switches, poking at walls for secrets, and trying not to get killed before you figure out what the level actually wants from you. A lot of it comes down to finding one half of the answer and then hunting for the other half. You might find the gold door first, so now you need the gold key. Or you might find the gold key first, and now you have to remember where the gold door was. And I know that sounds pretty straightforward, but while you're doing that, the game is constantly throwing things in your way. You're trying to remember some locked door you saw 20 minutes ago, while enemies are surrounding you, platforms are falling apart, traps are going off, and every room looks like it probably has some new way to kill you hiding in it. So the keys feel like progress, but only if you actually know where you're supposed to use them. Finding a key gives you a little bit of direction, finding the door gives you the other piece of that. The actual progress comes from remembering how those pieces connect inside the level. The switches have that same kind of uncertainty to them. Sometimes you pull a switch and immediately understand what changed. You hear something open or you see a wall move, and you know the dungeon just gave you a new path. Other times you pull a switch and now you have to go looking. You start running back through rooms, checking doors again, looking for a wall that moved somewhere else and hoping you notice whatever changed before the level kills you again. And then sometimes the switch just kills you. That makes every small decision feel risky. Opening a door, pulling a lever, walking into a hallway, stepping onto a platform, checking a chest. All of it carries this little bit of tension because the game teaches you early that normal progress can turn into a death trap without much warning. After a while, it starts to make you paranoid. You walk up to a switch and flip it, then immediately sprint backwards just to get out of what might be a kill zone. You start paying more attention to the environment around you because the game's trained you to assume that everything might be a clue. If there's a skeleton lying next to a switch, you start wondering whether that switch killed him or if something else did. If there's a pile of arrows against a wall, it suddenly feels like a warning that arrows might be flying through the hallway soon. All the small details like that start making you cautious. The dungeon teaches you to look at a room and think about both where you need to go and what might happen when you get there. The secrets are the same way. They feel extremely 90s. Sometimes a wall is just a wall. Sometimes it slides open if you walk up and interact with it. A lot of the time, there's no clear marking or clue telling you it's special. Because the game is so harsh, it feels like you're expected to find at least some of those secrets. You'll check dead ends, press against random walls, walk into corners, look in empty rooms, and wonder if there's something hidden there, because extra health, weapons, ammo, or items can make a real difference when the dungeon is just being this mean to you. This is where the structure kinda starts getting under your skin. You stop treating the dungeon like a straightforward path. Every area starts to feel like a puzzle. Is there something hidden there? Did that switch actually do anything useful? Am I supposed to come back later? The game trained you to look at every area with a little suspicion, because there's always the chance that something important is being hidden just out of sight. That happened to me more than once. I'd be working through a section, mostly thinking about keys and if the floor I was standing on was about to break. Then suddenly, I'd realize the game had pushed me into a boss fight. It rarely felt like a big staged finale. Most of the time, it felt like the dungeon just decided this was the next thing I had to deal with. And that gives the whole game a weird flow. You're always moving forward, but it rarely feels straightforward. Progress usually comes after wondering, dying, remembering, checking something again, and slowly building a mental map of the area. I think this is probably the point where the Tomb Raider comparison starts to fit. That comparison mostly comes from the basic setup. You're running around these big 3D levels, dealing with obstacles, figuring out where you're supposed to go, and kind of piecing the whole place together as you move through it. Then Deathtrap Dungeon adds its own personality on top of that. The overall world just feels harsher, progression can be painful, and the dungeon constantly asks you to prove that you're paying attention. And for me, this is the real puzzle of the game. A lot of the actual objectives are simple. Progress usually comes down to finding what you need and figuring out how the level connects together. The challenge comes from doing all of that inside a place that's constantly trying to break your focus. You're learning the dungeon one piece at a time. You learn where the traps are, which walls look a little weird, where a switch probably goes, and which part of a level you can just run through versus the spots that you really have to slow down and take your time on. And even when that design gets frustrating, I think that structure fits the game. The whole thing is built like a trial. If you've made it this far into the video, thank you for hanging out with me for a bit. I really do appreciate you. If you're enjoying it, consider subbing. There's already a lot of content on the channel like this, and there's always more coming. If you want to help the video grow, leave a like and drop a comment. Let me know if you've ever played this game or heard of it, or just if you have memories with it. If you've been waiting for the next video, I really appreciate your patience. I know this one's a bit later than usual. There's been a lot going on recently. I just hadn't had as much time to work on it. But we should be back to the normal schedule after this one. But that's enough of all that. Let's get back into Deathtrap Dungeon and look at the combat and the platforming. Now let's talk about actually controlling the game, because understanding the dungeon is only half the battle. The next challenge is learning how to make your character move through it. The controls are one of the first major things I had to adjust to. Movement really has that late 90s stiffness where you kind of wrestle with the controls half the time just trying to stand where you want to stand. You do get used to it eventually, but it definitely takes a bit before it starts feeling natural. You're running through these big areas, hopping over gaps, climbing past traps, and trying to figure out where the game wants you to go, and just hoping the camera gives you a decent view of what's happening. Fighting monsters and searching for keys is only part of moving through the dungeon. A surprising amount of the game is built around jumping. You're constantly lining yourself up for leaps across pits, trying to judge distances, crossing narrow ledges, and figuring out whether a gap is actually reachable. Because a missed jump usually means falling to your death. Even simple platforming sections can feel pretty tense, especially when the controls and camera are already working against you. And there's an interesting mechanic tied to the platforming. The game has this momentum bar. When you sprint, the bar fills up, and that affects how far your jump goes. So for certain jumps, you can't just stand near the edge and hop across. You need to really run up to the edge. You have to line yourself up, sprint in a straight enough line, build the bar, and then commit to the jump. And I actually think that's pretty neat. It gives the jumping a little more weight because distance is tied to your movement. You feel yourself building up to the jump instead of just pressing a button and flying across a gap. The rough part is everything around it. You're doing that with the tank controls, the awkward camera angles, and a game full of pits, traps, and weird platform edges. In my playthrough, there was even times where textures seemed to pop through other textures, and I couldn't fully tell where the platform actually was. I don't know if that was the PC version, or just playing it on modern hardware, or something else going on, but when that happened, it made the platforming even harder. So a jump might already require a full sprint and a proper setup. Then the camera angle or visual weirdness makes it hard to judge the landing. That gives movement alone a lot of pressure before combat even starts. Then once the combat does start, the game has another learning curve waiting for you. At first, fighting feels really confusing. Like I said earlier, this was one of the things I could just never figure out as a kid. I would press attack, expect the character to just attack normally, and the whole system felt like it never made sense to me, because that's not how it works. Coming back to it now, I learned the combat has a specific set of rules it expects you to learn. You have to hold the attack button, and then hold a direction. Holding attack and pressing forward gives you an overhead swing. Holding attack and pressing left or right gives you different side attacks or thrusts. And then holding attack and pressing back lets you block. Once I understood that, the combat made a lot more sense. I still wouldn't call it smooth. It's still just as clunky as it looks, and it takes time to get used to. But at least I finally understood what the game was asking me to do. The first step was learning the input system. After that, the real learning came from figuring out which attacks work best on different enemies. Some enemies are pretty manageable once you understand their timing. You watch them move in, block when they swing, then attack during the opening. There's a rhythm to a lot of the basic fights, and once you start seeing it, the combat, I think, starts to feel satisfying in a weird way. I think the dismemberment is a big part of that. You land a heavy swing and enemies explode into pieces. Arms, legs, heads, bodies. The game's super violent in this exaggerated old PC way, and I think that's part of why the combat stuck with me. Even when the fighting felt awkward, landing a good hit was satisfying because the game made sure you saw the results. That's probably one of the reasons I remember the game so much as a kid. Even when I had no clue what I was doing, I remember how brutal it looked. And then the bigger enemies change the way you have to approach the fights. Something like a minotaur can still hurt you through a block. And honestly, I think that makes sense. You're blocking a massive creature swinging at you, and you're just blocking with a sword. Then you have enemies that push the combat in completely different directions. The mechs are a pretty good example of that. Those fights usually turn into running around trying to avoid whatever they're firing at you and looking for a chance to hit them with explosives or something stronger from a distance. So the game keeps changing what combat is asking from you. A normal enemy might be about timing. A big enemy might be about blocking what you can and accepting that some damage is going to get through. Other enemies might be more about movement, distance, and finding a safe opening to use something heavier. Then the game starts throwing multiple enemies at you at once. And that's where the normal fighting becomes a lot harder. You can usually figure out one enemy pretty quickly. A group is a different problem because they're rarely attacking in the same rhythm. You might block one swing, then another enemy hits you from the side. You finally get an opening to attack, and then something behind you steps in and punishes you for taking it. So a lot of the group combat becomes about repositioning. You're backing up, turning around, trying to keep everyone in front of you, looking for a little bit of breathing room, and doing your best not to get stuck against a wall or caught on some weird chunk of the level. The camera can be a big problem here. Sometimes it gives you a decent view of what's going on. Other times it picks the worst possible angle and suddenly you're fighting the camera as much as the enemy. I wouldn't say the camera is always the biggest problem since the combat already has a lot going on, but it definitely doesn't help when it decides to get in your way. Then there are the weapons themselves. Stronger weapons can be extremely helpful. Better swords can make fights shorter, and some of the ranged weapons are extremely strong. The game has some wild stuff too, like laser guns, blunderbusses, flamethrowers, and other weapons that feel completely insane next to a fantasy dungeon setting. But you can't lean on those forever. Ranged weapons need ammo, and the stronger stuff is rare enough that you naturally start saving for bigger enemies. I usually held the better ranged weapons for things like dinosaurs, larger mechs, or bosses that I stumbled on. The swords have their own issue because most of them can break, so even when you find a stronger sword, it's not like the problem's solved forever. You still have to decide when to pull it out, how much you want to use it, and whether the enemy standing in front of you is actually worth wearing it down for. The silver sword is a great example of that. Ghost enemies are extremely weak against that weapon, so if you waste it or break it before running into ghosts, you have a real problem. It creates a strange kind of pressure around your gear. You're not only thinking about the fight right in front of you, you're also wondering what the game might throw at you next. A stronger weapon can make things way easier now, but if you burn through it too fast, you might end up regretting it later. And then there's magic, and it kind of works more like an extra layer on top of everything. I used it off and on. Sometimes I would use it on normal enemies, and sometimes I would use it to weaken stronger enemies before going in with melee. A lot of it came down to experimentation. The game doesn't really ever tell you what works best on what, so you end up trying different spells on different enemies and just seeing what happens. The giant spiders were a good example for me. I didn't know fireballs were especially effective against them until I tried it, and after that they became one of the enemies I always wanted to hit with magic first. If you explore enough and find items, the game usually gives you some room to experiment. You can find the weapons, ammo, magic, potions, and all kinds of extra stuff hidden in side paths and secret areas. So poking around and exploring actually pays off. The more you find, the more options you have when things start going sideways. The stronger stuff still feels like something you don't want to waste though. You can play around with some of your options, but the really powerful weapons and resources feel like something you save for the moment when the game starts getting insane. Or more insane than the base level insane. And then you have to actually use all this through the menu system. That part stayed pretty awkward the entire time. The game splits your options across separate function key menus. One function key opens your melee weapons, another opens your ranged, another's magic, and the last is items, potions, and buffs. So instead of cycling through everything in one inventory, you're constantly jumping between different menu categories depending on what you need. The things I used constantly, like my normal sword or health potions, I could usually get to pretty quickly because I just memorized it was F1 1 or F4 1. Anything outside of that felt like fumbling through a drawer while the house is on fire. You're trying to block, run away, switch menus, find the right weapon, grab a potion, maybe pick a spell, and somehow stay alive while your hands are spread across the keyboard like spider legs. That's probably the best way I can describe it. The game gives you a lot of tools, but using those tools under pressure becomes part of the fight. And that's really what all this comes down to. Deathtrap Dungeon is hard because the dungeon is brutal, but it's also hard because pretty much everything you do has a little bit of friction attached to it. What makes all this interesting is that none of these systems exist in isolation. Platforming, combat, weapons, magic, and inventory management all constantly overlap. A difficult jump might immediately lead into a fight. A tough enemy might force you to decide whether it's worth spending durability on a better weapon. A bad fight might leave you scrambling through menus for a potion while trying not to die. The challenge comes from juggling all these moving parts at the same time instead of dealing with any one system on its own. The more I played, the more things started to come together. I got better at lining up jumps, started figuring out enemy timing, blocking, moving around fights, saving stronger weapons for when I really needed them, and knowing when to pull out magic or ranged attacks all started to feel a lot more natural. It always stayed clunky, but once I understood what the game wanted from me, there was something satisfying about pushing through that clunkiness and making it work. So we already went over the basic setup for the story at the start of the video. You choose Red Lotus or Chaindog, you enter the Deathtrap Dungeon, and try to survive long enough to come out rich, famous, and still in one piece. And honestly, that's most of the story in the actual game. There's a little bit more flavor around it though, especially once you start looking at the manual in the original book. I think it's worth separating what the game actually tells you from the extra content that comes from the manual and the source material. From the game itself, the story is mostly there to just open the door. You pick the character, the dungeon gets introduced, and then the game pretty much lets you jump right into it. Red Lotus and Chaindog aren't exactly deep, complex characters. They just simply have different designs, different voices, and their own general vibe. But for most of the part, they're just the people you use to make your way through the dungeon. Once you're inside, the game really stops worrying about the story at all. From that point on, it's just mostly exploring, fighting, staying alive, and seeing what horrible thing the dungeon throws at you next. The game does give you a little bit of text around the major sections, and those help set up each area, but you're never stopping for a big story scene or character moments. Most all of the time, the dungeon's doing all the work. The manual, though, fills in a few more details. In that, it explains that the town, Fang, was once known as the Town of Plenty. Baron Sukumvit rules over it, and Deathtrap Dungeon becomes this massive, deadly labyrinth connected to that town. According to the manual, the dungeon was originally created as a challenge for the bravest warriors in the land. A trial designed to test skill, courage, and endurance against impossible odds. Over time, it grew into a famous spectacle, drawing adventurers from far beyond Fang in search of glory and fortune. The prize is 10,000 gold pieces and the freedom of Fang. But the real goal is killing Melkor the Red Dragon, the supreme beast waiting somewhere inside. That gives the whole thing a bit of a clearer goal. You're still entering for the prize and the glory, but now the dungeon has a final creature sitting at the end of it. Melkor gives the whole trial a clear destination. It's nice having that goal hanging over everything, because it makes the journey feel a little more focused. Instead of just surviving room after room, you know there is a giant red dragon waiting somewhere down below. The original book has its own version of that setup, and it's a bit broader than what the manual sets up. In the 1984 book, Fang is a frontier town that's become famous because of Deathtrap Dungeon, this sprawling underground labyrinth created by the Baron. Every year, adventurers travel there hoping to do what nobody else has managed, survive the trial of champions, and claim the enormous reward waiting at the end. One thing I really like about the book is how much time it spends building up the whole event around the dungeon. This is the place that everyone knows about. Travelers come from all over to take their shot at it. Warriors show up chasing gold, fame, and the chance to do something nobody else has ever pulled off. The Barons basically turned the dungeon into a huge public challenge. The book also leans a lot into exploration and uncertainty. Most of the adventure is spent making choices, taking chance, and dealing with whatever strange trap, monster, or disaster shows up next. You never really know what's waiting around the corner, and that unpredictability becomes a big part of the experience. I think that helps explain why the game feels the way it does. Even with its extra bosses and 90s era additions, a lot of the appeal still comes from simply making your way through the dungeon. The challenge is what draws people in, and the dungeon itself ends up being the thing you remember. And the book makes the whole thing feel more like an event. It's almost like a fantasy blood sport. The dungeon becomes part of Fang's identity. It's something the town's known for. I think it's pretty cool because it gives the world a little more personality. Fang's more than some random town sitting above a dungeon. It's a place built around this horrible yearly spectacle. People come to watch, warriors come to prove themselves, and the Baron becomes famous because of the dungeon's cruelty. It's a simple idea, but it gives the whole thing a weird kind of logic. Of course the dungeon's unfair. Of course it's full of traps. Of course it keeps throwing monsters, locked doors, fake safety, and sudden death at you. The entire place was built to make your life miserable. You're not supposed to stroll through it comfortably. The game doesn't bring over every piece of the book in a detailed way, but it keeps the basic feeling. The game's built around a simple but super effective idea. Entering a design nightmare where just making it through is the story. I think that's probably the best way to look at the plot in this game. It gives you enough to understand why you're there, then the rooms, traps, enemies, and bosses take over. The late game dragon stuff is probably the closest the game gets to feeling like it's building towards a real payoff from the source material. As you get near the end, you start running into some of the bigger monsters connected to the book. The Blood Beast, the Three-Headed Hydra, Vilfor, and eventually Melkor. That gives the ending a bit of extra weight. You're reaching the last room with a clear destination in mind. The trial's been pointing towards a monster from the very beginning. But even then, the game doesn't suddenly become story-heavy. You get the boss gauntlet, you get the final confrontation, and then the game pretty much ends the same way it spent most of its time, just throwing monsters at you, trying to kill you, and finding one last nasty surprise to stick in your path. The game really doesn't need much more than that, though. Everything important gets established pretty quickly, and after that, the game mostly focuses on exploration, combat, and staying alive. The dungeon's really the main attraction. The story is mostly there to give you a reason to head down into it in the first place. Because the real memory of Deathtrap Dungeon is getting lost in some maze-like section of the dungeon, pulling a switch and immediately regretting it, finding a hidden wall by accident, hanging onto a weapon because you have a feeling you'll need it later, and stumbling into a boss fight before you're fully ready for it. The story just opens the door. The dungeon's what you remember after you step through it. So now we have to talk about how this game actually landed. And I think this is where Deathtrap Dungeon becomes pretty easy to understand from both sides. Because after playing through it, I can see why people bounced off it. I can also see why the game still has a small group of people who remember it, defend it, or at least find it interesting. That doesn't mean I think everyone was wrong about it. A lot of criticism makes sense. The controls are rough, the camera gets in the way, the platforming can feel awkward, the combat takes time to understand, the menus can be clumsy while you're trying to fight, the dungeon is maze-like, and the game loves putting you in situations where one mistake can kill you instantly. So critics and players had a hard time with it. I get it. Especially in 1998, by the time the game hit store shelves, people already had a pretty solid idea of what a third-person action 3D adventure game was supposed to feel like. The late 90s were packed with games built around exploration, puzzles, platforming, and cinematic action, and Tomb Raider had become one of the biggest examples of that style. Fair or not, people were always going to compare anything that looked similar to it, especially when it was published by the same company. People saw the third-person camera, the tank controls, the platforming, the switches, and the traps, a female playable character, then immediately put it next to Tomb Raider. And that's fair from the outside, but at the same time, I think it's worth separating the comparison from the idea that the game was just doing the same thing. The similarities were obvious, and the people were always going to notice them. But Deathtrap Dungeon was also trying to adapt a very specific kind of fantasy adventure with its own focus on traps, combat, and just staying alive. The comparison still followed it anyway, though. And once people started making those comparisons, every rough edge became a lot harder to ignore. Because Tomb Raider was already clunky in its own way, especially looking back now. It had a very specific feel to it. You learned how Lara moved, how to line up her jumps, you learned the grid-like structure of the world. There was a kind of logic to the movement once you understood it. Deathtrap Dungeon has that same DNA, but it feels less controlled. The camera can change angles in ways that make the room harder to move through. Jumps are tied to momentum, which is an interesting idea, but it can feel awkward when you're dealing with that tight spaces and strange viewpoints. Combat asks you to hold a button and press directions, and the game throws enemies around you from multiple sides. So even when the game has a method, that method's buried under a lot of little annoyances. That seems to be where a lot of the old criticism came from. GameSpot's PC review was fairly mixed on it. From what I found, the reviewer basically said the game delivered a lot of what Eidos advertised. Lots of enemies, weapons, spells, huge levels, traps, and plenty of fantasy action. The same review also pointed out that if someone already disliked Tomb Raider's third-person perspective and camera, Deathtrap Dungeon probably was not going to win them over. That tells you a lot about the problem. The game was offering more combat, weapons, and enemy variety, and more over-the-top fantasy action, but it was still stuck dealing with camera and control problems that people are already getting tired of. The PlayStation reviews were even less impressed. A lot of the criticism focused on the camera, the seams, enemies showing up out of nowhere, all the trap deaths, the slow turning, the general feeling like the game has expected you to die first and figure things out afterwards. I only played the PC version, so I can't really judge how those specific PlayStation problems felt in practice, but a lot of the bigger complaints sounded pretty similar. Because I ran into plenty of the same kinds of issues on PC. There were definitely times where I died because I made a bad decision. There were times where I died because I didn't understand the dungeon yet. There were also plenty of moments where the camera controls or just figuring out what was going on made things harder than they really needed to be. And that's the tricky thing with this game. The challenge and the clunkiness are tangled together. Some of the danger feels intentional. The dungeon's supposed to be hostile, it's supposed to punish you, and make you paranoid around switches and chests and anything else you run towards. That's part of the source material. The game was always trying to recreate the feeling of surviving a deadly dungeon where bad decisions have consequences. So a lot of the punishment, the repetition, trial and error design, it feels like a natural extension of that idea. The execution can still be rough though, and that's where a lot of the reception starts to make sense to me. A person in 1998 could look at this and see a game asking them to tolerate stiff movement, awkward cameras, limited saves, instant death traps, crowded fights, confusing menus, breakable weapons, limited ammo, and huge maze-like levels all at once. That's a lot to ask. Especially when Tomb Raider was right there, and for a lot of people it was the standard for this style of 3D action-adventure game. So I don't think the rough reception is some mystery here. The game was harsh, it was strange, clunky, and very demanding. Some people were going to see that as depth or challenge, but a lot of people were just going to see that as frustration. And both reactions are valid. Looking at the game now, I think it becomes a bit easier to understand what it was trying to be. Today, we've got a much easier way to talk about this kind of game. We're used to games that expect you to fail a bunch of times before things start to click. We're used to learning enemy patterns, memorizing dangerous areas, and figuring things out through trial and error. Dying, reloading, and trying again is just part of the process. There's definitely moments where I found myself thinking this is kind of like Tomb Raider and Dark Souls thrown together in a blender. You die, reload, adjust, and try again, and after a while you start getting the hang of the dungeon. You remember where the floor breaks, which switch caused problems, which hallway looked safe but definitely wasn't. That's where the game becomes a lot more interesting to me. Because once you get past the initial frustration, you start to see what the game's actually going for. The game has the shape of a Tomb Raider era action-adventure, but the attitude feels closer to an old dungeon master trying to kill you with a grin on his face. That doesn't make the game polished, or magically fix the awkward controls, or make the camera behave, or turn every cheap death into something fun. All that stuff's still there. What I ended up appreciating more is how committed the game is to its whole thing. It really wants the dungeon to feel dangerous and unfair and constantly out to get you. Honestly, the title tells you exactly what you're signing up for. Pretty much every part of the game is built around making the dungeon feel like it wants you dead. Looking at it now though, Deathtrap Dungeon never really became an important game. It didn't launch a major franchise or redefine the genre. It didn't leave behind mechanics that other developers rushed to copy. When people talk about influential late 90s action-adventure games, they talk about Tomb Raider, not Deathtrap Dungeon. For a long time, this was more or less the end of the story. It's remembered, when remembered at all, as a rough fantasy action game that lived in Lara Croft's shadow. But time has a way of changing how games are viewed. Today, Deathtrap Dungeon mostly survives as this weird curiosity. Looking back, it's interesting because it sits back at the crossroads of a few different things. The fighting fantasy license, Eidos trying to build another third-person action-adventure franchise. And that awkward period where developers are still figuring out what 3D action games were supposed to be. A lot of modern takes on this game tend to be nicer than the reviews it received at launch. The controls and camera were still common pain points for people, but there's also a lot more appreciation for what the game was trying to do, and how it completely commits to being an absolute nightmare for the player. Its reputation today mostly sticks around because it feels so different from everything else. People tend to remember the weird stuff, the giant insects, the dinosaurs, the mechs, dragons. The way the dungeon seems willing to throw basically anything at you as long as there's a chance it might kill you. People remember how brutal it could be, how frustrating it could be. Most of all, people remember that there was nothing subtle about it. The game wanted to be a death trap, and it succeeded. That leaves Deathtrap Dungeon in a kind of weird spot. It's not some lost masterpiece that everyone somehow missed, or it's not a hugely influential classic game. Honestly, it's not even the easiest game to recommend, but it is memorable. And for a game that spent decades sitting on the margins of gaming history, that might be enough. And that's Deathtrap Dungeon, a game that made me bang my head against the wall more times than I can count, and one I'm still glad I finally went back and played through. Because as frustrating as it could be, there was a reason this game stuck in my head for so long. I thought it was so cool as a kid, and coming back to it now, I can still see why. Just everything we've talked about makes it so memorable. If you've been waiting on this video, I really do appreciate you being patient. I know this one's a lot later than my usual uploads. There's been a lot going on, and I just really haven't been feeling great the last few weeks, so it's slowed everything down more than I wanted it to. So I really hoped y'all liked it, and I hope it was worth the wait. After this one, I should be getting back to a more normal schedule. If you haven't yet, consider subbing to the channel. There's a ton of content already on here like this, and there's always more coming. We're getting super close to 15,000 subs, and I really think we can hit that soon. Leave a like and drop a comment. Share the video with a friend if you know somebody who would enjoy this kind of stuff. Also want to give a huge shout out to all the channel members. I never really have the right words for how much I appreciate you all. And I don't ever want to push anyone to become a member, but if you do want to support the channel in that way, there's some neat perks in the different tiers, like exclusive Let's Plays and game nights with me. But again, thank you all for being here. I hope you liked the video, and as always, I'll see y'all later.